The one question I have is just why did you just put the dicks in like that? Like, why is there just that one scene where like 8 dicks just swing out? What was that? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I'm just puzzled. That's all.
Welcome back to Foreplay. We are in the midst of our Sword and Sandals arc. What does this mean? We're watching movies that are 3+ hours long, that are epics in the true sense of the word epic, mostly from the golden era of Hollywood.
But we're watching movies. This is the second one that literally has a break where if you're in the cinema, you can leave and go to the toilet. Like that. This is another one with an intermission in. It actually has another where they play a whole like 3-minute song, like an orchestral song or something. You're like, what is it? That's how long these films are. It's wild. It's wild.
So if you missed it, last week we were doing 1959's Ben-Hur. This week we are doing a Kubrick film, our first Kubrick film, surprisingly. 1960's Spartacus. Next week we'll be doing a more contemporary film from the 2000s, the Troy, but director's cut version of Troy, which means the one that's over 3 hours long, of course. And after that, we will do a combined episode of Gladiator 1 and 2. So guys can enjoy all of that. So this is all of these films. Sword and Sandals is the term that's used to distinguish films that are set either in the biblical or ancient world. So this would be ancient Rome, ancient Greece. You got kind of that hybrid crossover in Ben-Hur, where it took place mostly in Judea during the time of Christ. But this could also refer to, films like the Charlton Heston 10 Commandments, Cleopatra, some of these films from that, 1,000-year time window of ancient history. And Spartacus, the movie that we're looking at this week, is actually focused on historical events. Not that Ben-Hur wasn't, but this is another one that is actually talking about a Roman Republic immediately prior to the founding of the empire, slave rebellion by a gladiator slave named Spartacus. This was a real historical event that happened, and many of the major characters are real historical figures that have been dramatized for 3 hours for our viewing pleasure. I'll start this off and say I've seen this movie before, obviously, but I haven't seen it in 20 years or so, 15, 20 years. It was substantially worse than I remembered it.
That's an interesting take. I actually enjoyed this movie. The thing I guess like where I would maybe criticize it, the pacing. This one bizarrely felt a little bit longer than Ben-Hur when I was watching it. There was some like lulls in the story beats that felt it kind of dragged out the movie, and I was kind of thinking this isn't really necessary because there's not a lot of things happening here on screen, but we've got a lot of like dialogue, a lot of interplay with characters that ultimately they don't really matter a great deal to where the story's going to end up if you know the story about Spartacus. And I was very surprised because usually with the one thing you would say about Kubrick movies is there's generally not an ounce of fat on them. Yeah, they can be long, they can be decadent, but everything serves a purpose. But I do think this was a little bit fatty. I thought there was some parts you could have easily trimmed this down. I mean, considering it's a 200-minute long experience. It certainly had periods where it was like, right, I know what's coming next. Can we get to that? That would be great.
I mean, it was also just like the number of montages that this movie has is absolutely crazy. And it's not just a snappy montage to move the storyline along or to show progress through time. It is literally the driest, most slow motion montages, which now, you might enjoy some of these extravagant shots, such as training the slave army, where they're slowly riding around on horses, or the gladiator training. I mean, it actually is a film that manages to have multiple training montages in it, montages about the toils of their travels, which end up kind of ridiculous, particularly the one where they're marching over the mountains, and it's supposed to show the hardships of the slave army, but ends in this honestly laughable scene of them burying a baby, which just seems incredibly, to me, ham-fisted, that it really dropped me out of it. And
Right.
to this point, what's weird
Probably
about this
deeply
movie
shocking at the time in like 1960 or whatever.
Sure,
but fine.
yeah, true.
Evil Monty strikes again.
It's just so cheesy, man. It's just so cheesy. And honestly, for me, the worst parts of this movie are actually the Spartacus parts, and the most interesting parts are the Roman political drama that take place with Crassus.
Monty's
In a movie called Spartacus.
2-sentence review of Spartacus. The bits with Spartacus in are a bit shit. The incredibly dry Roman political intrigue, that's what I'm here for.
I'm
That's
a
the most on-brand review, though. I know it's so good.
That is actually
it's banger. It's a banger. I kind of like that 3-hour Spartacus film, except for the parts of Spartacus. What was he doing? I know.
I mean,
What
look,
insane thing. I love it.
as we'll get to when we cover Gladiator. Gladiator is essentially a soft reboot of this.
By the way, I was
movie.
thinking that the whole time. Like,
Yeah.
one of the things about this genre that's been interesting is this might be inadvertently the tightest genre we've ever done. Almost every film overlaps into the other films. And by the way, bear in mind, we obviously reverse engineered this for Gladiator, guys. Gladiator refers to almost all of these films, if not like directly just stealing concepts and shots and things.
Yeah.
Like all the training of the Gladiator. I'm thinking the same thing, Richard, when you get in the training sessions and how you can be free. It's just like Gladiator, like just a 60s version of it, yeah.
Well, I mean, obviously a lot of parallels as well with like Peter Ustinov in this and Oliver Reed and
absolutely.
And you could see that when they were making Gladiator, this is the blueprint. Now, on that note, what I would say is if you really like Gladiator, and most people do, it is lauded as a modern classic. It would be inconceivable if Spartacus hadn't happened. And a lot of people go back and forth on what's the better movie. I would be inclined to stick to the prescribed wisdom that it is indeed Spartacus, for reasons we'll no doubt get into. But I mean, what I love about what Gladiator did is it sort of essentially streamlined what Spartacus was saying. And where it wanted the plot beats to go, and it probably has a more satisfying ending actually, Gladiator, compared to this. This ending kind of sputters out a little bit. The way I remembered it in my brain, by the way, was it ended with the crucifixion.
I know what you mean. By the way, it should. Everything after that is just irrelevant. But sadly it keeps going.
It did that Lord of the Rings thing again, where it's like you've got an absolute straight fire ending served up to you. But I suppose there's all these like little story beats that we have to tie together, and they do try and get one more emotional scene out of it with Spartacus murking his homie, but it dragged at the end a little bit.
How about the scene at the end where he's actually just on the cross, which is fucking terrible, and he doesn't even look like he's in any amount of pain whatsoever?
I mean, it's Kirk Douglas, mate. What do you want? Like, he's one of the biggest stars in the world at this time. Like, so now I won't have any slander against Kirk here, right? That's an outrage. Because what you got to remember is in Gladiator, because Russell Crowe was on his bullshit. There's that scene at the end where they made a little mound for him when he's dying in the last scene. Spoilers, right? And it was a pillow. It was an actual pillow because he was sick of lying down for 14 hours a day. And you can see it in the fucking movie. There's actually in the death scene. He's lying on a pillow because he won't lie on the ground. At least Kirk got up there for a fucking fake crucifixion, Monty. So no, you can't have that. That's bullshit.
I tell you what, at the beginning, I've got a few points on some of the things you guys have said. So first of all, one of the reasons why this is the least Kubrick film is actually all this detail. Kubrick was brought in after the film had begun. They had a different guy, Anthony Mann, who, by the way, is a guy who's done loads of film. He did like El Cid right after this. He's obviously doing that type of a film. This guy, apparently, after a few weeks, they just kicked him off the film. And because Kirk Douglas had just done Paths of Glory with Stanley Kubrick, who at the time hadn't yet got the Kubrick reputation, he was just a really good director at the time. He basically was sort of like, hey, I know this guy who did a film before, bring him in, he'll do it. So as far as I can tell, it even says on Wikipedia, he didn't have full artistic control over this film. This is more like he's just like a jobbing director doing a gig, potentially even for a friend or for another opportunity to do a big blockbuster, you know. So to me, it's not really a very Kubrick film. I mean, I agree with you. I also think as well, I know what Richard means about the Kirk Douglas angle, because I actually have a lot of affection for Kirk Douglas as an actor, but one of the things I actually really like about him is his whole style is to be over the top. Like, he's one of the most overwrought actors you'll ever see.
Take that back to your Senate. Tell them you and that broken stick is all that's left of the garrison of Rome. Tell them we want nothing from Rome. Nothing. Except our freedom.
Like, this is not a guy who ever tried to put, like, the difference is actually, if you want to compare him, someone like Russell Crowe tries to put a lot of subtlety actually into some of his performance in Gladiator. Kirk Douglas's style, it's why he's best in films like Paths of Glory with that righteous indignation, Lost for Life, where he is Vincent van Gogh. You don't know, he owns these roles. Like, when you watch them, he's incredibly overwrought and mega, like, you know, passionate and chewing the scene up. But to me, you sort of, that's what you want when you, it would be like complaining about an Arnold Schwarzenegger film because he didn't have great dialogue and just said witty one-liners. Like, yeah, that's what you go and watch those films for. So I think it sort of works. Like, here's the difference. I can buy the ticket and take the ride when it's Kirk Douglas. Like, I do think in
100%.
good films he is really good. I sort of do know what Monty means, though. Like, I do think the difference for me is I find the character of Maximus mega compelling in Gladiator. I actually find Spartacus himself not that compelling. And unfortunately, part of the problem, I do think, is that the film Gladiator exists. It's just a better version of this film for me. So it's like, I do think as well, I know what you mean about the pacing. When I watched Ben-Hur, it was the opposite. I was like, it's really slow pacing, but I agree with you. I was checking and going, holy fuck, like I'm 2.5 hours through it though. Like this is actually like, it's sort of flown by, even though individually I'm thinking how slow it is. I agree. This one, when it got to the intermission, I was like, fucking hell, how much longer is in this film? Because one of the weirdest things about this era is I don't know what it is that makes them so slow, because they'll have whole scenes where we're not even talking about lines that should be cut. There's just silence. Like there's like seconds and seconds of silence between every line. So every single scene, by the way, where two people, like the lovers, for example, meet privately, holy fuck, these scenes could be 2 minutes. You know what I mean? Like they last 10, 15 minutes, but they could be 2 minutes. And I definitely agree with you, Monty. There are scenes where it's just stuff like you just keep repeating the same theme over and over. Like, by the way, I get it that he loves that fucking slave girl. You've done about 8 versions. I get it. Like, that's an example where like, that's not as essential to the plot as you think, and you keep hitting it too hard, if you know what I mean.
Every line, every curve. I want to know every part of you.
Yeah, I mean, look, well, on that note, I think one of the reasons why these, like, and the epics in particular, they do drag, you have to understand, I mean, this is 1960, which sounds like, oh, we're about to get into the swinging 60s and everything's going to be modern. But, like, in terms of film telling language, you've only really just come out of an era where everything in terms of what you put in the frame is super important. You know, if you think about coming out of like post-war, and then we get in the 50s, and obviously noir that we've talked about, and kind of, you know, people want the shots to tell a visual story. And so what you end up happening is you end up in a lot of these epics, starting in the late 50s and onwards, you end up with these like very long visual shots. There's a lot happening in the scene, but there's not a lot happening in terms of dialogue. And I think for a modern brain, what we're used to now is there's almost like, I don't want to say minimalist because that makes it sound measured, but when you watch a movie these days, it's like it shows you a flash of something and you go, all right, they're there. That's the establishing shot. You don't really care about this long tracking shot of like, oh, wow, look how there's hundreds of people working on a chain gang out here to build this Roman thing. And then a Roman guy comes into shot, still no dialogue. So, okay, it's definitely the Romans. And then it's going to track up here. They don't do that as much in kind of modern movies because there's almost like a semiological shorthand that we all have, that when we look at images now, after decades of having movies as a storytelling archetype, you know, we just get things sharper and faster. And so when you go back and you watch a lot of these older movies that really are taking and setting the scene because that was the style that it came out of, particularly, I mean, obviously when there was no dialogue and there was no sound, you know, there was like a tradition that was still kind of there in the epics. The epics were, by definition, a throwback to a bygone era that people were trying to be evocative of. And obviously, by 62, you know, you've got the fucking Lawrence of Arabia just blows everything out of the fucking water in terms
another film that never ends, by the way. It just never ends.
Exactly. and that was it. That was kind
a much
of
better
like,
movie, in my opinion.
It's good film.
Oh, sure. That's kind of when, for me, that kind of like modern epic was essentially perfected there, you know. But everything was ramping up to that point where it's like after that, it's a long way down, you know?
I do agree with Richard. There is almost like a literacy that we take for granted everyone has. I would even give you, since everyone who watches this show pretty much is from esports, it's the reason why, spoiler, the modern day esports player isn't really like evolved beyond the one from 20 years ago. He just got to watch 10 years of esports all when he was coming up. So when he starts, he's already got a shorthand for the game and how to compete that the guy in the beginning in 2001 didn't have. That's essentially the point Richard's making here. Is like we've all been trained essentially, especially in the modern day, with like MTV style fast cuts to just do that like screen flash of thing, like you said, like a screen, like an image of something. You don't need to have a whole establishing. I agree. I think that's a good point actually. By the way, I even got one minor thing here where I don't know if Richard was going to do this later, but they even actually have one scene in this film, which by the way, it serves almost no purpose. You already know what Roman's like anyway. You know this angle, but they actually tried to get edgy in one scene. That one scene where Laurence Olivier, who by the way, obviously all-time great actor, has that scene where he explains to the Tony Curtis character or whatever, that weird analogy where he talks about, does he like snails and oysters, or does he think snails? As far as I can tell, that's just an overt fucking like reference to like being gay or straight. Like it's just, they've just popped that in there in the film. By the way, at the time, that would be mad edgy in 1960.
Oh, sure.
So they took it out. They took it out of the film.
Right.
It was actually filmed, and then they re-added it in the 90s,
right.
I believe, because it was supposed to be in the original cut, and it was too spicy, but they had lost the audio. So Anthony Hopkins actually did the voice for Laurence Olivier's character in that scene in a redub, because Laurence Olivier was dead. So they actually had to redub that with Anthony Hopkins doing a Laurence Olivier impersonation.
It is all a matter of taste, isn't it?
Yes, master.
And taste is not the same as appetite, and therefore not a question of morals, is it?
But yeah, because the reason I say that is because someone watching it now is just even going to be like, okay, but it's like that actually was edgy at the time, even though like it's actually quite a soft fucking analogy. Even it's just snails and oysters. It's actually even pretty good model to give. I don't know, the idea that was cut's kind of wild in itself, isn't it?
Well, I mean, because isn't that what's implied at the end? Because that like what's it called? Antoninus was going to be a sex slave.
Yes.
Yeah. So the reading is when he murks him, it's like he's sparing him, basically getting touched and whatnot against his will, right? I mean, so I don't know if that's explicitly what it was saying, but once you introduce that kind of thing, and that's interesting because I don't think I've ever seen a cut without that in. So I actually didn't know that.
Okay.
But I've only ever seen it with the, yes.
No, it makes sense in the era we watched it, yeah.
Yeah, and instantly, obviously, you know what's going on there, and especially that wouldn't even be shocking. It wouldn't even be framed that way in ancient Rome. It wouldn't even be framed. It'd just be like, I fuck anything that moves because I am Roman. And that was how
that would be very, very Roman, by the way.
Yeah,
I mean, the decadence, like it would not be shocking whatsoever.
Which, by the way, does lead into one of the obvious problems. All modern Hollywood films that are historical epics are tainted by the biggest problem ever, which is you always have to make the lead character basically be a progressive person from politics of that day. So what you always inevitably do as a result is like you try. This is why the downside of it is, even though it works because we do relate to them as a result, it makes the films all ahistorical because you have a guy who's essentially like a 90s Democrat voter walking around going, "You're all a bit regressive here in bloody ancient Rome." Like it's like, what are we doing at this point in time, guys? Like,
I mean, I want to talk about that.
Slavery. You're doing slavery. Like you are a slave, you idiot. What are you talking about? You haven't known anything else. You wouldn't even be able to conceive of a world without like what, like, and that part goes a bit too far for me. Even though, by the way, I buy into it in the film, obviously, and just accept the suspension of disbelief. It's all good.
Well, it is a piece of its time, right? Because this is when we do have to this is a time period in which there is civil turmoil in the United States due to Jim Crow laws and everything like that. But also, it's the era of McCarthyism, and Dalton Trumbo famously wrote this film, but he was blacklisted by Senator McCarthy, and so he was writing under pseudonyms, but also clearly, he was everybody was being accused of being communist, but this in some ways is a piece of pro
Monty, I'm going to say
propaganda,
exactly,
because the slavery is the slavery of the working class, right? And it is a revolt against the rich elites. Yes. And to your point, Thorin, if we actually talk about this historically, I was laughing during the voiceover narration because they're like, basically slavery is wrong, and it would be another 2,000 years until slavery was fully abolished.
Even at the zenith of her pride and power, the Republic lay fatally stricken with a disease called human slavery. The age of the dictator was at hand.
To be clear, guys, as somebody who studied Latin and classics, in the ancient world, slavery was incredibly widespread. It was very different than the slavery practiced in the United States in the 19th century and previously. Sometimes it was horrible, but also a lot of the times it was actually better to be a slave in a rich house than to be like a fucking pleb, because you were very well taken care of, by the way. And many, many, many slaves were given their freedom at this time. You really could earn your freedom.
They say in this film, remember, that like actually this is an angle that people wouldn't think of it. By the way, one thing I did actually look up once after watching Gladiator is the premise of how accurate is the Gladiator aspect. If people don't know, actually most of the film's over-sexy.
It's like WWE.
It's more like WWE with rare occasions when you have a fight to the death, which, by the way, this film actually explicitly does say, like, they have the scene where, like he says, Peter Ustinov guy basically says, like, hey, if you do a good job, you can live 5 or 10 years or maybe even get your freedom. And they also do point out in this one that in training, we don't fight people to death, obviously. That's why those like senators or whatever like actually make that request as like a specialist request, you know.
I would also say that it's important to think about gladiators more as WWE entertainers, even though many of them, not all of them, were slaves, because they were really valuable. It's like, just think about this from an entertainment perspective. It is much better to build up the reputation and have a famous gladiator than have a guy who's, every guy's getting killed after 2 fights, right? You can never actually build up hype in that case.
It's why they explain in this film and Gladiator itself the idea that if it was a real fight to the death, Monty, my only goal would be kill you so I live. They go out their way to explain, no, make a show of it, like stab him this way and then cripple him and then they're actually almost explaining that there's a performative element to it. You're not really just fighting to the death, come on.
With a cripple, you've got him if you keep your distance and wear him down. The rest is all right for a public spectacle in Rome. Here in Capua, we expect more than just simple butchery.
But they were just too valuable.
Makes sense, of course.
The time. And especially
once
if
you're good, by the way. What if you're a champion? Yeah, you don't want to destroy that guy.
Especially if they got a lot of fame. Like, you want to have them be, the Roman Colosseum equivalent of, like, The Undertaker, right? You want them to actually have promos and build.
Which, by the way, Monty, is essentially what they did in Gladiator. Remember, when Maximus has beaten everyone else, they bring back that, like, legendary undefeated guy who's, like, got his own freedom. That's even basically like The Undertaker coming back at fucking WrestleMania to fight whoever the current big...
I'm not going to pretend it wasn't dangerous, but it's far less dangerous than fiction would have you believe.
Oh, and also,
like,
throw
really
this in.
Obvious reasons.
Here's the other thing to throw in as well, Monty. The reason the Gladiator angle especially is actually a straight fire story angle is that's a way out of slavery. On the other ones, you just wait in slavery till someone buys you out or you just get, like, the grace of your master. In this one, if you're, like, a fighting age man who has skills, you can actually, through your own merit, achieve some sort of freedom and, by the way, spectacle, fame, money, and all that. It's even almost like there's like an agency to people in the world of the Gladiator.
Well, I mean, that's also why it's one of the things that Gladiator does well, I think, is obviously, because this is historically accurate, that Commodus, he wanted to kind of like LARP as a gladiator, and he would get into the arena all the time. He would fight animals. He would he used to hold what he would call like the pleb games, where basically it would be open to the public. And we
need to do this in esports, LFN pleb games.
Yeah, exactly right. So like so think about this, right? You've had all of this, like, what Monty's talking about. You've had all of this prestige where you've got this curated, almost WWE experience. The best gladiators all have personality and cult followings, and the fans go there to see them. By the time Commodus, because he's after Marcus Aurelius, right? So Commodus, by the time Commodus is doing all of this bullshit and like LARPing and all of that, right? Like, it's not the same experience. And when you start opening, like, imagine opening WWE, Vince McMahon comes out and goes, right, today, pleb games. And just the general public come in and they're breaking each other's necks and breaking their arms. And it would be a horrible thing to witness, but probably a great spectacle. That's kind of like where Commodus was at. But like, back in these days, the Spartacus days, they're dropping like flies here, and that's just like not historically accurate whatsoever. That would not be the case.
And also, just we'll talk about this in the Gladiator thing, but Commodus actually was he was presiding over a piece of a part of large prosperity in Roman history. So he wasn't this like evil douche.
Well, but he did inherit like a prolonged period of peace, right? Like and prosperity. I don't know if I don't know enough about him, to be fair. Commodus wasn't one of the areas I read about. That was kind of like a little bit later. But I know he got assassinated, obviously, by he got killed by a wrestler.
By the way, one thing I do think that they established very early in this film, basically from the beginning, and you have to, if you're not into this angle, I'll give you, here's an example when you won't watch this film, because it's really long and it's an old-fashioned film. If you don't like, within the first 10 minutes, the fact that Spartacus is like, has a bad attitude and can't handle authority, the whole film's about that. This is like some Cool Hand Luke shit, where it's just about a guy who like just refuses to sort of ever bend and break, as it were. So like, if you don't like that angle, this movie isn't for you. If you do like that angle, I think that's a very classic trope. I think if you do it well, you pull on people's heartstrings, then it makes him a mega heroic character. But from the outset, that character is like that. Like, they almost make it like this guy had to be this person,
She's been sold. No talking in the kitchen, slave.
You do not have to be naked like a Roman slave. You can choose to garb yourself in Into the AM men's apparel instead. In addition to graphic t-shirts like the one I'm wearing, you guys can get unbranded t-shirts, workout clothing, joggers, hoodies, bomber jackets, button-up shirts, chinos, and anything else your heart desires over at intotheam.com/LFN. And good news, right now until February 9th, Into the AM is having their anniversary sale, which means you can get up to 50% off on everything on the site. In addition to that, you'll get another 10% off by using code LFN at intotheam.com/LFN. You'll always get an additional 10% off with our code, no matter which sale is going on. It's a great value. They ship to many international destinations outside of the United States for free. So if you haven't checked it out yet, head over to intotheam.com/LFN and see if they've got the right clothing for you.
Onto the subversive elements of the screenplay.
By the way, Monty is right. That guy, imagine that, Richard. Imagine being brought up by McCarthy. Sir, I'd put it to you that you have put subversive communist materials. What are you talking about? All I've done is create these scripts like Spartacus. It's like some commie wet dream, this film. It's mental.
Well, Trumbo did like a bunch, didn't he?
He's never beaten the allegations, though, is he? Like, come on.
No, not at all. But like, didn't he do? Was he the guy who wrote? What was it? Was it Johnny Got His Gun or whatever?
I think so. Yeah. No, he did a whole bunch, mate. He did load of bangers. Yeah, loads of films.
So I mean,
that was adapted from a novel, but
yeah, that's what I mean. But like I don't know if he actually wrote that novel.
He wrote the novel. Johnny Got His
Gun.
Mate,
he did. He did. Johnny Got His Gun. He did Papillon. He did Roman Holiday. This guy did some fucking scripts, mate. This guy was working.
That's what I mean. Like, the reason, obviously, Trumbo isn't a kind of household name, although again, with a modern history appraisal, he's now kind of recognized for what he did. But the reason you don't know his name probably as much as you should, relative to what he did in American cinematic history, is because obviously of the House of Un-American Activities bullshit. And so, when he wrote this script, this is a perfect thing for him to adapt. Essentially a working class uprising, against the cruel masters, violent revolution. And the original, because he adapted it not from the historical story, he adapted it from a novel as well.
All right.
I will also point out that unlike other violent class revolutions, this isn't like, the people rising up against Tsar Nicholas in Russia. Remember that Rome was still a republic in this era. You know what else was a republic? The United States of America. So it is, this is supposed to be an elected-ish body or a representative. It wasn't really elected, but whatever. Like a representative body that people were rebelling against, right? So it was. I think it was even spicier as a result.
Oh, sure. And I said that you think about the year it's in, 1960. I mean, yeah, it's a very tumultuous kind of period in American history. We're setting everything to rights theoretically at this point, and there is a lot of civil unrest and a sense that civil unrest can be a mechanism for change. And then you come out and you write a script where literally not only is it about a revolution, but also it has an unbelievably charismatic central figure played by Kirk Douglas, who, by the way, I'm sure I always kind of thought of him as being a bit like the inverse of John Wayne, because Kirk Douglas is a very muscular physical actor like Duncan was talking about, but he was hyper aware of the politics, whereas like John Wayne did the searches and didn't realize he was the bad guy, right? So, you know, very, very different personalities, but very similar styles of acting. Kirk Douglas is this very charismatic guy, but it's a reason he did movies like you already talked about, you know, Paths of Glory and stuff like this. He did a lot of fucking subversive films that attacked institutions, and I think he was like, for all of the appearance of him being, you know, in shape, out of shape 50s guy with the barrel chest, I think he was somebody that like did have a sensibility for that younger generation and their politics, and was probably happy to sort of participate in a story where the subtext is very progressive.
By the way, random detail as well. Shout out to Kirk Douglas. If people don't know, he only died in 2020 at the age of 103. And by the way, he absolutely was a guy where he actually what he looked like from his like 70s onwards will blow your mind, mate. Like, you have never seen someone who actually kept their looks in this way. Like, he actually, by the way, he also just, to me, he just has like an actual like Giga Chad face, mate. Like, I agree with you, Richard. Like, it's obvious why you'd cast him in these mega masculine roles, but he clearly has like a depth and a nuance to him. Like, he's not just some like blind idiot going out there and doing it. He's obviously got some extras, some more sauce in there, you know.
He got that red eye chin.
He does. Yes, it's fucking mad, isn't it?
His chin is absolutely mega. It's the ultimate chin. There's like no getting.
No, he has like an iron jaw. It's mega, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, look, I'll just say this about Kirk Douglas in this movie while we're talking about him right now. I mean, first of all, I love Kirk Douglas. Kirk Douglas has done so many movies that I have a lot of fondness for.
I'm just imagining Kirk Douglas as Red Eye. Like, Richard, I'm going to need that op-ed by tonight.
No, but like, I'm Red Eye. No, I'm Red Eye. but like, I've got a lot of fondness for a lot of the films he did even prior to this, which is obviously Paths of Glory, which we talked about. But I mean, one of the first kind of like Sunday afternoon epics I ever watched was The Vikings. Which I remember watching that with my grandparents, and I fucking love that film. It's got, you know, him and Tony Curtis again as, you know, friends. They were obviously they did.
Is it as good as 13th Warrior?
Yeah.
I'm just being a prick on that door.
But I mean, like, you know, if you think about the scene where he's dancing on the oars on the longboat at the start, where they're all drinking and doing all that. This is shit like Kirk Douglas would just turn up and do that. Right. You know, he was just one of those physical actors that like also could add a bit of gravitas to parts that maybe would have just been in other hands. They would have been, you know, you're a bit of a chump or whatever. Sure. And then by the 70s, when he was kind of going out of fashion, you know, he still did some very like interesting, you know, kind of roles and performances, which he doesn't get enough credit for. But obviously, as you said, the longevity he had in terms of his like career, considering he started in the 40s, is fucking insane. But I think he's great in this movie. I think his performance is a big reason to like this film and watch this film.
When just one man says no, I won't, Rome begins to fear. We were tens of thousands who said no.
All the performances I feel like are good. I mean, Peter Ustinov is stealing the show for the first 45 minutes, which would be, by the way, very boring, or I would say even more boring without him, because I think the like slave to gladiator arc takes so long in this movie. It takes almost an hour. But Peter Ustinov, who, as you guys
got to get your money's worth. Kirk Douglas just sweaty, grimy with his top off, though. You've got to get your money's worth.
By the way, that's another thing they definitely repeated. All the training scenes, like again, that could have been like one or two scenes. Because same thing as Richard said about the Crusade thing, bro. In my mind, about half an hour they're into him already being off being the slave freed. Bro, that takes ages to happen. That takes ages. It takes so long.
And Peter Ustinov really holds those scenes together, but Laurence Olivier also just incredibly good as Crassus.
I mean, they are cheating with the casting.
Yeah,
I mean, like, there's no way, like, you can't serve up a bad film with a cast that is just like just all these fantastic contemporary actors. You got Kirk Douglas, as I said, a star at this time in the 60s. You got Laurence Olivier, widely regarded as one of the greatest actors of all time, if not the greatest. Peter Ustinov, fantastic character actor. Tony Curtis in a bit part. Like, just in a bit part.
Charles Lofton, who played Gracchus, is
Charles
also a
Lofton.
famous stage actor of the time.
Yeah. I mean, there's probably some other names that were like, missing off. I want to give a shout out to Woody Strode as well, who plays obviously the Ethiopian dude Draber. He's he's like very important historically, but a lot of people don't know this. But he was a wrestler, and he's in the 1936. There was like a commemorative for the 1936 Olympics. There was like some commemorative booklet that was made, and he was one of the athletes that went in that. At a time when obviously American, were being encouraged not to highlight the black athletes because it might offend, Nazi sensibilities or whatever. He's in that, and he was one of the first black NFL stars as well. When he came out post-war. So like, Woody Strode is fucking. He's just a mega dude, like just a fucking great guy. And I think he's awesome in this movie. And in the very brief part that he's in it, I think their friendship and then subsequent trident launching, I think it's fucking great. I love that scene.
Kill him. Well, what's the matter now? Kill him.
Kill him, you imbecile!
Kill him!
Kill him!
That's one of the best scenes.
By the way, I agree. The cast is, if people aren't familiar with this era, the cast is mental. I mean, as you say, the idea of Tony Curtis, who, by the way, looks like he invented fucking emo / the goth genre. Like, this guy, he was just born with eyeliner permanently on his fucking eyes. It's mental. Like, this
what
guy,
a beautiful
I know,
man.
it's great. But he also is very good looking. If you don't know, by the way, he essentially becomes
man.
like Kirk Douglas like 10 years later. He's enormous, but he's just a side guy. Like, that's just someone coming up. And then all the other cast is mental, like we say. If you have character actors and you got Laurence Olivier, by the way, Laurence Olivier in this one shows his acting range. He actually comes off very differently in a lot of other films. Oftentimes he'll be almost like an effeminate type character. He's a very sort of like, he comes off as really manly and strong and sort of like a fucking fierce character in this one.
Rome is the mob.
No. Rome is an eternal thought in the mind of God.
Did you truly believe 500 years of Rome could so easily be delivered into the clutches of a mob?
Obviously, Charles Lofton kills it as well. By the way, the woman who I'm not super familiar with, Gene Simmons, I'd say her main thing is she just has very piercing eyes. She wasn't that great an actress. She was all right. But yeah, no, the actual, like, the main casting people in it, obviously it's a cast of enormous amounts of people for all the other scenes, but the main central body are all very legit. And yeah, as you pointed out, Peter Ustinov kills it in this film. He's very good.
Yeah. I mean, this is one of those where it's like, I think Peter Ustinov definitely understood the assignment, which is, look, if you want to show off the flamboyance and decadence of ancient Rome that we associate with it, through the filter of history, you have to do a part that's like a little bit over the top and a little bit out there. You can't play it straight.
His is almost more like when you get really good actors get a role in like Game of Thrones or something, and they really embrace it and go. He looks like a modern actor in this film. A lot of the other ones are doing that sort. You just read the script, you go to the next line.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. He's on some like Charles Dance shit
or
whatever.
Absolutely.
Like just electric in every scene that they're in. And he really got the assignment. I totally agree with Monty. I think if Peter Ustinov or like if they'd cast somebody else, I think that was even a possibility. If they'd the first 45 minutes of the movie would have been excruciating. I think it would have been real tough because obviously every scene Ustinov is in is compelling to watch. He's really good.
Mate, he even allows you to forgive otherwise unacceptable shit in scenes, like that one where like that Gracchus or whatever's coming. He's like, "Oh, quick, take this big statue. I can't lift it." It's like some Chuckle Brothers shit, mate. What? Yeah. Put a thing over it. Like that would come off as really fucking hacky, but because he's just killing it with his like speech and his presence, you don't mind, mate. All of his scenes, I was just enjoying. I was just sitting back enjoying, mate.
Crassus here. Varinia, my red toga, the one with the acorns, and some chairs in the atrium. Second best wine. No, the best, but small goblets. Gracchus, you know how Crassus loathes him. Take him away.
Yeah, absolutely. But like I say, I mean, I think overall the casting in this movie, like, there was no risk of you were ever gonna.
No.
It was never going to be shit. You know, it would just be impossible.
Oh no, when you guys
impossible.
were saying earlier you didn't like the film as much, it is still worth watching, especially if you've never seen it. By the way, this is almost every film in the series we're doing now. Just it's worth a watch again for your literacy of film history.
I agree.
I'm Spartacus.
I'm Spartacus.
I'm Spartacus.
I'm Spartacus.
I'm Spartacus. I'm Spartacus. I'm Spartacus. I'm Spartacus.
I mean, just the line "I'm Spartacus" and the scene at the end is mandatory
Yeah,
viewing.
absolutely.
And there are a lot of things to like about this movie, in the same way that there are a lot of things to like about Ben-Hur in terms of the scope, the number of people, the spectacle of it. The costumes are amazing. The cinematography is fucking great. I mean, I just look at this and I love all the shadows that Kubrick is playing with. I love some of the individual shots. I mean, Kubrick is obviously so good at framing things, but even shots where they're descending into the gladiator pits and going back up.
Yeah.
I think my favorite shot in the movie was after Woody Strode's character Drabba dies and they're following, like, all the gladiators are marching down in front of his body that's been hung. Is just beautiful.
By the way, there's actually a lot of ambitious shit in this film as well. I'll give you an example. The way they show you, before you've seen an actual gladiator fight, the way they have them getting ready for the fight, and then they're sort of in, like, the dugout, as it were, Monty, and you just get to see them, like, him through the wooden thing. What a cleverly set up shot that is, like, to even have the idea to do that shot. Because remember, if you could just do the shot itself of them actually just fighting in the arena, but you're trying to put us into his perspective, and we're getting, like, a glimpse of it. We can sort of see, but we're not seeing the full thing. Also, by the way, I'll just throw this out there.
Fucked up that way because they're like animals in the cage waiting to be slaughtered.
Oh no, absolutely.
That's their perspective. I mean, it's very menacing.
Also, by the way, just like almost all great epic films of this era, one thing you can never fucking underestimate is how good the soundtracks are in this era, mate. It's all just great orchestral music that fits the scenes, and like if it's a heartfelt scene, they'll put the right strings. You know, if it's a big epic scene, they'll do the big trumpets and stuff. In this era, they'd nailed music. I actually think, by the way, the two things that have aged the worst in Hollywood is soundtracks and lighting. Like, lighting is fucking terrible in modern film. You know what they like? Oh, make it realistic. Bro, the best thing about these films is it's not realistic. They put light on someone's face so I can see the performance. And then similarly, in the modern day, obviously you use modern music, don't you? I actually think this type of orchestral music works really well on these films. I think it sets the pace for me.
I generally agree with you, but in this film, I actually hate the music.
Oh, fair enough.
I find it to be incredibly saccharine, especially in some of the earlier scenes with Varinia and Spartacus, where they're in there, and it's just like the little flutes, like.
Varinia. I thought I'd never see you again.
I'm just like, get me out. It's like so 60s at times. But in general, I mean, I like Ben-Hur's soundtrack much better, and I do like the massive like scope of the orchestral soundtracks from this era. Obviously, like very famous in a lot of these episodes.
All that was taking me out of those scenes was that this guy's just a mad cock with a fucking ran through hole. Like, you know, fucking, that's his love. Like, he's doing everything he can to just get a little feeling of her hand. She's fucking the Spaniard the night before, getting bareback. Like, they're watching through the top. Fucking, yeah, go ahead, Spartacus. He's like, please, milady, may I kiss thy hand?
I thought it was so funny. He's like,
he's a gentleman, Duncan. You know nothing about it. You know nothing about it, sir.
I'm like, Spartacus, she doesn't get paid if you don't have sex with her. Like, you're actually just messing this up.
And also, bro, logically,
she's just gonna get put into the
exactly.
Next
if you don't fuck her, she is just gonna get fuck the other guy, you idiot. And he hasn't thought this through at all either, Monty. Remember what I said earlier? If you are the guy in the trope of I don't like authority. By the way, authority always crushes you 24/7 in those films. Spoiler: you've given away that you like this girl. I wonder if they're gonna do anything with this girl to fuck you over. Like, think about it. Think about it.
You have one now, Spartacus. You must take her.
Go away.
What will she think of you? Indeed, what will I think of you?
Go away.
It was obvious.
I mean, I'll say this on the topic of Kubrick's direction. This is kind of like very interesting because, as Duncan said, obviously this is the first time he was essentially like brought in to pick up a film. He'd already done like 4 movies by this point, and he was 31, right? So just a mega fucking talent. But this is the first time he sort of didn't have any creative control, and he was like a director for hire, and it was like, just finish this fucking movie. And it's kind of sad because he never thought this was a good film.
He disowned it later on.
Yeah, he like had a real tough time accepting this, and obviously it won a bunch of Oscars. It was like super expensive.
I think it said it was the highest grossing film at the time or something.
Yeah,
Wasn't it some crazy shit like that?
Huge commercial success.
It was the most expensive movie as well.
Oh,
it was actually it cost more than the value of the studio that made it.
Oh yeah. It was crazy, and unfortunately, on the one hand, it was bad for like personal relationships, like Kubrick and Kirk Douglas. I don't think they worked together ever again after this.
Right.
And but what it was really good for was it cemented in Kubrick's mind, I can actually do anything.
Right.
Because as far as he was concerned, this was such a shit production. He was arguing with actors. He had no creative input. He didn't have authority over the edit. He got to make some script alterations, which is what Douglas was pissed off about. Apparently, he cut all of the lines out of the early script. So Spartacus basically says nothing like for like 45 minutes. It's like that was Kubrick's choice, and that's what pissed Douglas off, and they all had beef about it and blah blah blah. But anyway, when he came out the other end, and everyone is lauding this movie that he thought was actually a piece of shit and made in terrible circumstances, if he doesn't make this film and have that experience, he doesn't go on to make like 2001, a fucking Space Odyssey, and all this other stuff.
Sure.
This movie literally instilled it in his brain. I can do anything, no matter how fucking audacious. It's 8 years between this and 2001.
That is insane, isn't it, to think of?
Yeah. 8 years. That's nothing. That is nothing. And yet he went from doing what is now, in retrospect, a quaint little epic movie, right, about ancient Rome, to making one of the most mind-altering, films of all time, so much so it's compared to taking LSD. So, this movie is so foundational in the Kubrickian myth because it gave him the insane ego that he needed to go and make these genre-defying movies.
But I didn't appreciate this one even as much as Ben-Hur, because I feel like it lacks so much, I guess, weight a lot of the time. Like it feels so forced with this political narrative and this modern, like viewing the slavery through a modern lens, that it doesn't end up feeling particularly real, even if honestly, like, I appreciate parts of the historical accuracy, such as, we talked a lot about the chariot scene in Ben-Hur, but the battle scene in this movie, okay, the stupid fire logs weren't real, obviously, but the way that they deployed the Roman legion in that like checkerboard pattern is very authentic to how the Roman legions would have actually fought during this time period. Plus all the immense work that goes into the costuming and making sure the legionnaires and the soldiers all look accurate, and the scope of it I do find to be very compelling. But the other elements, the class warfare, the very modern contemporary idea of love between Spartacus and Verinia is just kind of laughable considering the circumstances at the time.
Yeah.
The world was just much more brutal and cutthroat back then, and like slavery was just so accepted, not just in the Roman Empire, but like everywhere on Earth in the ancient world. And it always had been as well. So they would never have had these sensibilities.
By the way, the problem isn't the notion that anyone is against slavery. It's that they almost present the film as, well, obviously slavery's wrong, and everyone in this film should know it. And it's like, well, that's the part that doesn't work historically. What you need to do in some ways in this film, if anything, Monty, is have like a clever scene where somehow people realise because of Spartacus's actions that slavery's like, it's wrong, or something about it diminishes a person and doesn't show that. But unfortunately, they do just take it like basically 5 minutes in, Monty. Like Spartacus, obviously you are the correct person, TM, and you know that slavery's wrong, and every character that you meet in the film, the Romans, who doesn't, it must be destroyed. Like, That part doesn't really have a lot of nuance.
That's what Ben-Hur actually does do.
It did a better job, didn't it? Yeah.
This film. Yeah, there's shading to it because obviously, you've got is it it's Quintus, isn't it? Who adopts him in the movie, and it's like the fact that he saves his life. And he saves his life, and then he adopts him as a son, brings him into the fold. It shows that they weren't all bad, they weren't all monsters. We've got a cartoon villain in Ben-Hur, obviously, right? But we also have these other Romans that were gracious, and sort of in this you don't really have that equivalent. I suppose Peter Ustinov, but I mean there's almost like a kind of he's not Roman coded. If you know what I mean, in the movie, he feels very otherly to all the other Romans, if you know what I mean. In this movie, he feels like he's outside of that culture a little bit, I guess. He participates in it, but he's not from it. He's not dyed in the wool. He's morally flexible. And can see things both ways, but obviously isn't gonna put anything up stakes wise, that's going to impact on his life. But yeah, I thought there was a bit of an almost cartoonish portrayal of the world at this time.
I actually think, Monty, since you said it earlier, I actually think if I could go back in time, I would have made this the first film we watched, because I agree with you, actually. The problem is Ben-Hur was better than this. And unfortunately, in the ways that Ben-Hur was better, it sort of diminished this film a little bit for me. As well as the fact, like I said...
Got more lepers, for starters.
Unfortunately, I did also find... This is not a fault of this film. In fact, it's actually a flaw, obviously, with the way chronology works. But much like a lot of classic films like Citizen Kane, the things that are revolutionary about it were then done in other films or done better. So the problem is sometimes it's not as valuable now. Essentially, the problem is that Gladiator does do a lot of the Roman aspects a lot better than this film does and makes me care more. So, obviously, I needed this film to exist for Gladiator to exist later, but the problem is I saw Gladiator before this. You know what I mean? So I can't forget that I saw it. Unfortunately, that's just the nature of how it goes.
We could have done the films sequentially in terms of the time period as well, which would be Troy first, then this movie, then Ben-Hur, and then Gladiator, because this movie takes place, 70 years or so before Ben-Hur. And the Gladiator takes place in the 180s, I believe.
That's 80s, what I mean. That's what I was talking
300
about
years later
earlier with the Commodore stuff, because it's this is. I always thought that was generally considered when shit started going off the rails, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because everyone loves to make that parallel, don't they? About the
fall
fucking
of Rome and shit.
Oh yes, well it's the fall of an empire. Sure. You can tell all the hallmarks are there. It's happening in America now because these comparisons are perfectly acceptable and totally work.
Even though they've actually been doing that for 70 years, by the way. Every year, it's the bloody fall of the West. Bloody civilization.
I mean, there are just also really large distinctions to be made between the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire era, and this.
That's one thing they don't do well, Monty. That's one of the worst things about this film is I actually think a lot of people who are modern day viewers who watch it are going to watch it and not fully understand the time period and what you're saying about the Republic. It's only at the end you get that it's about Julius Caesar. It's actually built up. By the way, they even blatantly foreshadow that really early on. If a senator goes in with an army, then that means they make it so obvious.
The Rubicon
coming in about an hour and a half. You know what I mean? They do set that up, but the problem is, Monty, I don't feel like they actually do sort of a skillful enough job of making you understand why that's meaningful, because I know what you mean. Richard's right. Everyone thinks of Rome as the end of Rome. They think of it at the end of their emperor, and they always only think of it as an empire, by the way, and a world-spanning empire at that. This film isn't about that. By the way, Ben-Hur wasn't either. It was sort of more in the middle, wasn't it? So I do think that Ben-Hur did a better job making itself of its time period than this film did. I would have had a hard time guessing, except for knowing some of the things about Julius Caesar. Well, I would have had a harder time guessing what the Roman atmosphere is in this sense.
I will point out that when this movie was released, adults at the time would have had a much better understanding of classical history because they were classically educated at the time. So I think to a larger number of people, they would have understood the historical context of this film, whereas that education is not given to people unless you seek it out like I did anymore. But if you were American or English speaking at the time, you did study Latin. Period. You did study Latin. You probably read, historical tracks that were written by Crassus or Julius Caesar at the time. So it would have been, and by the way, this is in the historical time period, this is setting up the first triumvirate, which was basically the power grab by Crassus and Julius Caesar, and also Pompey, who was another Roman
It's
senator.
basically what the series Rome covers, if people remember. That was that exact storyline. With Mark Antony and all that.
Mega.
Yeah, it was mega. Yeah.
That was the second triumvirate with Augustus.
Oh,
so
right.
That came later.
No, but it had Julius Caesar as well in that as well.
Yes, Julius Caesar was part of that as well. But basically, the second triumvirate was caused by Caesar's death. And so that was, in the future when he was an older man. And this is pre the Gallic campaigns where he went and got really famous. Which is, that's when he comes back and he's a
basically that is
threat,
Rome.
right?
The beginning is the Gallic campaigns, and then they come back from it. Yeah, you're right.
Exactly.
Yes, exactly. So that takes place
massive
later.
Celebrity at that point, essentially.
Yes,
because like he just brought fucking Gaul to heel, all of this stuff. Yeah, it's a wild
he also
part of
had.
history.
Also, by the way, we've mentioned it many times before, but if you like these films, go and watch that series Rome immediately. Like, you're almost certainly going to like it. Almost certainly.
It's great.
It's also got an amazing cast too. It's got everything going for it.
Right, and all of that stuff takes place between Spartacus and Ben-Hur. Right, because the Roman Empire has been established by the time that Ben-Hur starts. Augustus has taken control. Octavian took control. But this is basically the start of the dissolution of the Republic, because Crassus is doing things that are problematic in terms of the rulership of Rome, which is why Gracchus's character is so distraught, because he's trying to basically control Crassus's level of power, and he fails in doing so.
Yeah, I think, certainly, just in general in cinema, like, that you don't really get when you watch an ancient, like, any movie that's kind of set in antiquity or whatever you want to call it, they don't ever really show the distinct phases. It's one of the things that I think modern epics do a little bit better, actually. They seem to do a much better job of, like, dialing in on specific moments in history, like we'll see when we get to Troy. But, there's like multiple other movies where it's like they take these they're essentially sea changes in history, and therefore the moment in and of itself is more interesting because and it tells a little kind of story within that moment of what's happening. This is Spartacus, so yes, obviously it's about the gladiatorial uprising led by Spartacus and all of that stuff. But in terms of what's happening in and around that story, it's just generic Roman shit, isn't it? It's just like they're not really. It's like one of the reasons the TV show Rome is really, really good, apart from the fact it's got a mega cast, mega script, it was one of the first things to kind of like transpose the ancient, into like modern, get all the British actors in. This is how you do prestige TV moving forward. But one of the reasons it's mega as well is like it does do that intrigue. It gets into it a little bit. Something Game of Thrones would do a little bit later. The whole point is, there was probably no more politically complex society than fucking ancient Rome. Everything you did, there was a public perception you had to consider. There was a private perception you had to consider. Alliances were all over the place. I mean, Caesar himself is a figure. It's like, eventually has all of these problems only to get murked by his friend in an assassination attempt. It's like, it's super intriguing stuff, but the old epic movies of the 50s and 60s, they just seem to eschew all of that, so you can have a chariot race or whatever, which is fine, but you're definitely leaving some good stuff on the cutting room floor,
Yeah. So look, I mean, I think this movie is definitely worth a watch. Having watched it back to back with Ben-Hur, it didn't feel like, outside of some of the lighting and cinematography, I was getting a wholly different experience. When, if your goal is to like see all of the epicness, I think Ben-Hur has all of the epic visual imagery, all of the epic set pieces that Spartacus has. It just has a more compelling storyline and better pacing without the endless number of montages. And it feels like it just takes so long for the actual plot to get going in this movie. And thematically, it's just very ham-fisted. By the way, it made me pine for the Jesus. It made me pine for the Jesus elements of Ben-Hur, where you had, it felt fun.
It needed some Jesus in this movie, is what you said.
I know,
Jesus.
Right?
That's what we needed.
By the way, you alluded to it earlier, but I do think one of the weaker parts of the film, unfortunately, is the love angle. Like, even though the actress herself, look, seems quite attractive, she certainly has, like, the piercing eyes. So I didn't find that, like, I thought that part, again, that was, like, one scene that turned into half the film, you know what I mean? Like, we get it, mate, we get it. And spoiler, yeah, we all know it's not going to work out in the end. Like, I hope that part is obvious. Come on.
Yeah. I mean, look, obviously, if it was a different time, the real love story would have been Kirk Douglas and Tony Curtis. That's the love
was
story.
True.
Yeah. You don't need to insert whatever her name is, Claudia or whatever, into this movie whatsoever. Verinia, sorry. You don't need her at all. She is. They do this a lot in movies. I was thinking about this just the other day, right? This is a tangent, so do excuse me. But I was watching Sergio Leone's Duck You Sucker, right, which is the last spaghetti western.
Yeah.
I don't know if a lot of people.
It's a super obscure one, but yeah.
Yeah, it's great, obviously. And in it, right, the story is about an Irish revolutionary going to revolutionary, the Mexican Revolution in what they call Zapata westerns, which are all like revolutionary themed westerns based on what happened in that historical period. And he's an Irish revolutionary who's fled Ireland. He's wanted by the British government. And I was watching this, right, and I'm like thinking, yeah, like there's something off about these scenes because he has these flashbacks and it's him and his mate, and then there's a woman, and in one scene James Corbyn's kissing the woman, and then it skips forward, then his mate is kissing the woman, and I'm like, what the fuck is this insane love triangle? And then the gimmick is James Corbyn, like his friend ratted him out to the British while he was working for like the IRA or whatever, and so he shoots his friend in the face. But what I realize is that she doesn't exist. They were gay lovers. They were gay lovers the whole time, right? And it's even in the theme tune. There's this thing whenever he's like whimsically thinking back, and it goes Sean, 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 and he's thinking about Sean. He's thinking about his homie, right? Like he's kissing his homie. The girl isn't real, but you just had to put that in there.
Oh, that was the proxy to get away with it, right?
Exactly.
You actually laundered homosexuality through the idea of a non-existent third-party
exactly.
woman.
Yes, correct. And like, I obviously didn't get that until now, right? I didn't get that until like now as a grown-up. I was thinking, yeah, it is weird they're in a love triangle.
Also just changed the meaning of the title, Duck You Sucker. So.
Suck You Fucker, I believe.
There you go.
The working title. But anyway, so
suck
obviously,
my fucking duck.
So the whole point is like, if you could have done it like Spartacus and Antoninus, that's the love story at the end when he kills him and all that, to spare him. That they should have had a thing, because that would have also been historically accurate. Of course, you took lovers. If you were a gladiator, you don't think gladiators just you think they were around all them fit men all day, and not one of them was like, yeah, go on then. Like, no, of course, they just couldn't do it. It's Kirk Douglas. You can't have him and Tony Curtis fucking going at it hammer and tongs. The world's not ready for that.
I love you, Spartacus, as I love my own father. I love you like my son that I'll never see.
Also, by the way, one thing I do think that they didn't do a great job with in general is because all the things about him raising the army and having the revolution are so long and drawn out. I also don't feel like it hits as hard as you think. In my brain, because I am, by the way, everyone who remembers this film but hasn't seen it for 10, 20 years, all you're remembering is the early Gladiator scenes where he's becoming a gladiator and fighting against them. Then he has like the rebellion, and then he has the crucifixion. I'm with you. I thought it was like 3 scenes and the film was just like, I was going to get through it. But holy fuck, does that part with the rebellion take so long? And the problem is, it doesn't hit the way you hope it does. Like, actually, again, I'll reference Gladiator. I think Gladiator is masterful how it actually has the rebellion sort of fail at the end, but in a very human way, where that is what happens. It's a bit like Braveheart. It's never really that the ultimate bad guy defeats you. It's that the weakness of your own partners and friends is what ends up fucking, and silly things like, one of them wanting to protect some of their people. That's what fucks you over. That's a very believable animal. The problem with this is, once once you get going and you're trying to build the spirit bomb of like righteous indignation that you got to do this revolution, it just dissipates by the time it ends. And by the way, it's obvious, it's always written on the wall where it's going in this one. Like, spoilers, surely no one really went into this thinking, is this like some Inglourious Bastard shit? Does he actually take over, checks notes, Rome before the Empire? Surely you don't think he actually wins in the film, you know what I mean? Like, you have to know which way it's, but the problem is, since I know which way it's going to end, don't draw it out this much though, you know, like make it a bit punchier, or make like a really big I'm with you could have ended on a really big moment, whereas they just let it all the energy drains
when
out
they're all crucified. That shot, you think about how it ramps up. You've got the iconic I'm Spartacus line, Kirk Douglas's single fucking tear that fucking kills it, and then they're all just
because that's all hitting. That's powerful as fuck. Yeah, that
look, they're in a man alive won't fucking. That's real shit. That's fucking, you know.
Well, no, that's like that meme, isn't it? You know what I mean? If do guys even have feelings? It's like that scene, I am Spartacus.
Yeah,
like,
exactly. I'm Spartacus.
Everyone would get that scene.
That's what. That's what's interesting about the revolution is that they're willing to die for each other, even though they know that is the result. It's the personal, you know, they have principles that they're willing to support each other and die for. The actual political stuff is, in terms of the revolution, is the least interesting part. Whereas I think the political stuff between Gracchus and Crassus is actually very interesting.
Oh yeah, by the way, as well, two other things. One, here's another aspect that doesn't work historically. Another thing is this. Yes, of course, an individual who was a slave would want their own freedom. But I've got bad news for you guys. Back then, just like in America, it was classic that when you got freed, you weren't against slavery. You were against you being a slave. If you don't know, there are famous examples in America of black men that were freed and immediately just got their own slave when they got their own farm. Because the point is, that is just what the milieu was at the time. That is what people did, unfortunately. So that aspect also is a bit silly, because it essentially, the notion isn't just like, hey, guys who are slaves, you don't want to be a slave anymore. Well, they could all say yes to that. You all agree that slavery is morally wrong and we should battle the people. No, like that part already, you've already pushed the boat out. And then secondly, they don't, unlike how the movie pretends, they don't all really just agree with him philosophically, slavery is wrong. He's just really charismatic, and they're just, like every film with a charismatic guy, they just go along with the cause of the charismatic guy. Like, that part doesn't really work, because that part is silly. Like, again, like I say, just like in the same way Richard said about sexuality, like back then, by the way, that's even another thing people don't realize. The reason why the Romans also were doing like fucking everything under the sun and a million mistresses is because it was about the idea of you got your public facing life with your official like political wife and all that means and all your business, but then you have your personal peccadillos and desires and things you do off camera, etc. That would all be totally understood as the way the world was back then. There wouldn't be anything shocking about this notion. In the same way as for slavery, it's just understood that is just the world we live in at this point in time, and the aim is just not to be the slave. That's it. It's not the idea we're going to get rid of slavery itself. That's not even conceivable back then.
Ain't no party like a Crassus party.
Well, it's also even just this movie's just tonally confused at times. So the example too is the last scene where he's strung up on the cross, and they're trying to have this very emotional moment where she's holding the baby and telling Spartacus, "Oh, I'm going to tell him about you." And then there's this comedy element with like Peter Ustinov trying to like hurry them along. Be like, "Please don't talk to him about the cross." Like, we got to go, love. I'm just like, what is the tone of this scene supposed to be?
You're right. It's that is a bit jarring.
Okay, like don't get me wrong, Ustinov's great in the movie, but yeah, they should have just been like, not now, Peter. Come on,
I'll tell him who his father was and what he dreamed of.
Already have mercy on us. Get in the wagon.
It's meant to be poignant. Look, the next generation will be there to rise up again. Your sacrifice won't be in vain. I promise you. Come along, ladies. Yeah, fucking nightmare. Whatever. Stop ruining this movie. I love this movie. You fucking.
He's making good points. That's the problem.
No, that's the problem. He's winning me over for a change. But no, look. Just to start wrapping it up, I think obviously, in terms of what it does for historical epics, mega important film. I think in terms of like the cast, very enjoyable. Even when it is dragging, you're gonna get rewarded with a really good scene. The reason it often isn't lauded in the same way Ben-Hur is it's scale and spectacle. There's not really a lot of that in this. Unfortunately, like there's nothing like the chariot race scene in Ben-Hur in Spartacus. There just simply isn't, and this is why Ben-Hur is the better movie.
Though.
Yeah, I mean it's good. It is good, and you can see where a lot of effort went into that. But it really isn't comparable. Ben-Hur is fucking big cinema. Like it's crazy what they're doing in that film. And so look,
the real problem is they didn't kill enough horses in this movie.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we needed. More dead horses, more dead stunt people, you know? But like, it's, I mean, look, central performance from Kirk Douglas, out of this world. You get to enjoy the genesis of one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. You can really see the craft and him getting his eye in a lot of these scenes and transitions from scene to scene. Fantastic performances from the supporting cast as well. Very enjoyable. Peter Ustinov stealing the show. Thank God he does. And it is a historic film. I'm like you. I still enjoy this movie for what it is, but having watched it so close to like Ben-Hur and having watched it so close to the rewatch of Gladiator, it was tough. It was tough to enjoy it as much as I remember enjoying it back in the day. I will say this, though, and this is a little bit of foreshadowing. It absolutely clears Gladiator 2, and it's not even funny. Gladiator 2.
I still haven't seen it.
oh, brother, my brother in Christ.
Put it this way, I've seen it as well. It's not. Here's the thing: it's not like a terrible film, but it's not good. Like essentially, here's the short version, Monty. Without spoiling it, it is a massive retread of Gladiator 1 in a very negative way, as in it just for real. Yes. Replays whole scenes and stuff, like, but in a way that's way too over the top. Like instead of cleverly using foreshadowing, essentially it's actually a rare example. I'll have to use the obvious. It's like The Matrix. You know how what you try to do with the Matrix sequels is just pretend they don't exist, so that the first one's a better film. Because unfortunately, if you actually allow the story to continue, it cheapens things from the first film. That's what Gladiator 2 does. Like you actually you want to go back and go, no, that didn't happen, and that isn't who his dad was, and that isn't, it's like that. It has some massive negatives. So yeah, I agree. It wasn't a good film. Wasn't as bad as people thought though, but it wasn't good. I'll give you that. It's quite an empty film put out there.
Oh, sure. So yeah. Anyway, watch Spartacus. Watch it once, and don't listen to any of Monty's commentary about it. Because it'll really
I think you two both earlier essentially nailed the real reason to watch it. It's not actually like an all-time great film. Like if you're watching this series and you only want bangers and 10 out of 10, this isn't one of them. It's not even that great. But the reason you watch it is, like I said earlier, you need to see the scene where he says, "I am Spartacus," and stuff. Like that is, again, it's like the reason why you tell people, whether you care about them or not, you always have to have read the Bible and Shakespeare, because everything else references it, or that is part of the like shorthand of the lingo that you're going to experience. So if you haven't seen that scene, and by the way, also it's worth watching just because of things like, surely if you're a film buff, you care about Stanley Kubrick and fucking Kirk Douglas. Like, these are pretty big names you're going to need to know about if you want to be informed
Laurence
about film
Olivier.
history. Yeah, exactly. So those reasons alone make it worth a go. But it is a fucking long viewing session, this one, so buckle up. You might need that intermission, put it that way, just to fucking clear your head,
And just to put in perspective, we picked 3 over 3-hour movies, and I have seen Troy Director's Cut recently. I saw it about 6 months ago, and I will watch it again before we record the next episode. But as far as Ben-Hur, Spartacus, and the Troy Director's Cut, this Spartacus drags the most by a lot. By a lot.
Well, you haven't seen Gladiator 2 yet. Gladiator 2 isn't even a long movie.
No, it isn't. It does feel long, though, yeah.
But it feels long, bro. Yeah. It feels long. It feels long. Put it this way, I watched that when I was in Bucharest doing the major, which, in case anyone's watching this, the reason there's been a long gap, it was all my fault, because I went to do an esports event. I not only went to do an esports event, told these two guys I would take my equipment to film, and then proceeded to get drunk on all my days off and have a hangover and not film.
Yeah,
so
but you were working like 14 days in a row at times, so
yeah. And some of those days were 16-hour days, so I needed to blow off some steam. Sure. There was no chance of me sitting down and watching fucking Spartacus on one of the days off.
I was suspicious when you said that you could.
Yeah. Well, listen, no, I absolutely could. What I realized in the moment was I absolutely will not. So,
well, but that's what I mean. We've all done those events, and like you got to have a drink after them sometimes. And...
But we did go because it was obviously on in the cinema, and there was a cinema not far from where we were staying, and I
But this way, I'll tell you the reason why I say it's not just a totally terrible film. Like, it's not like a 3 out of 10 for me. It's just like a 5 out of 10 film, basically. The reason why is this. It's actually not... Put it this way, even though if you actually watch the film, you're going to think, what was the point of this? If you actually wrote down the premise, it could have been really good, believe it or not. Like, actually... That's
why they keep remaking it.
No, but here's the thing. If you said to someone... Because bear in mind, I think that first film is almost... it's one of the rare, like, perfect one-off films. You don't need anything more than that. Like, it said everything. It ends. If you asked someone, how would you remix some of the ideas from that and like use them again or add extra, the premise isn't bad, it's just none of the execution works, and it, like I said, it just feels like an empty, soulless film, unfortunately. Like it felt like the seed was there to do something good, but it never germinates at any point in the film. So it's not a good film.
But put it this way, they should have made the Nick Cave sequel. Right, Nick Cave wrote a script for Gladiator 2 where Maximus is resurrected.
I'm going to look this up. This sounds mega.
Yeah. He's resurrected, and he has to go and kill Jesus and all his disciples.
Hell. Okay.
And then and then he goes through time and fights in the Crusades. Look it up, man. Nick Cave. Nick Cave's script.
The musician guys, by the way.
Yeah. You can find. I think you might be able to find like a treatment of it online as well. It is mental.
Does sound mad. Yeah.
But better than what we got, unfortunately, with the exception of my man Denzel, legend.
The Spartacus concept, I think, really does have legs and could be made into something that's really pithy and hard hitting and fun. I haven't seen the Spartacus TV series that they made in like the early 2010s, or I think they remade the movie as well. So I haven't seen any of the other versions because they're badly reviewed and not, they're not supposed to be very good. But I mean, I do think that this is a concept that can, in theory, be done well.
Well, listen, I never watched the TV show. There was obviously the Spartacus TV show as well. Whenever I watched it, it just looked like it was just a guy who just stood there with his cock and balls out, and that's fine. But like, it was like.
You weren't watching that Watchmen film again.
Yeah, exactly. It was like we were on that Talk to Manhattan shit.
By the way, to this day, bear in mind in the comic, he just has a totally normal, like, anatomically unerect penis. I'll still never understand why. That's the one question I have for Zack Snyder is just, why did you just put the dicks in like that? Like, why is there just that one scene where like 8 dicks just swing out? What was that? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I'm just puzzled. That's all. I'm just puzzled.
But anyway, I never saw it. It was like, what was it, Blood and Sand or whatever the TV series was called, and
there was one that was called Spartacus, and I think a different one called Blood and Sand.
Right.
They've done a couple TV shows,
but they were doing that thing where it was like, in the absence of being good, like to be prestige TV, it's like we'll just be shocking, and so here's some fucking it's TV but with nudity, and we've chopped his head off. Look, obviously in a fight, not the penis. But anyway, I never watched that because it's like you say. I think the Spartacus story is really compelling historically. But like, how many ways are there to retell it? Like, yeah, he led that revolution and he gets crucified and that's it. Really, it's the same thing every time. So I don't know. I think this is the one and done. Like Gladiator essentially remade Spartacus, changed all the characters around, made the movie essentially the same beat for beat, but like say more streamlined. And that's it. That's it now. That's the Gladiator uprising movie, and
the political angle even works better in Gladiator. Like, that is the end of the Empire potential, that now it's getting to the corrupt point. So now there's even an extra justification for why you need to topple all of this, and who could do it except the general and the one who gave them it. Like, that's even just better done. They just hit the points better, unfortunately.
Yeah. So look, I enjoyed it. I definitely think this was the one I said we had to do if we were doing Sword and Sandals. I definitely remembered it a little bit differently to how it was, but I felt that way about Ben-Hur as well.
Yeah.
It's mandatory. It's just mandatory.
No, by the way, this is also why it was interesting to do, because I have to say, I had it the other way around. From memory, I thought Spartacus was the better one and Ben-Hur was the one that dragged, and it was the other way around when I rewatched it now, I have to say. Like, I agree with you at the beginning. I thought the pacing, even though it was very, very long in Ben-Hur, I just enjoyed it, all of that. I'd sort of soaked it in. This one, I did sort of keep checking, like, oh, fucking hell, we already 50 minutes in, we're only on this one. I did think that a few times.
Yeah. So look, this is a 7.5 out of 10 movie for me, with iconic scenes and a great central performance. Ben-Hur is the better movie. Gladiator might be the better movie. I don't know. I might still give it to Spartacus just to be a pretentious snob. but ultimately essential viewing once, if nothing more than the iconic "I'm Spartacus" scene, which will break hearts.
There we go. Yeah.
Well, very good, guys. That'll wrap up our discussion of Spartacus. Next week, we will skip forward 45 years in time and go to the Troy director's cut, a film that's
just how long the movie is.
I'm a giant Iliad enthusiast. Clearly, this is not super accurate to the Iliad, but I actually have a very soft spot in my heart.
I think it's both a good film. It's not a truly great film. It's a good film, but also, if you like this stuff, it's a guilty pleasure because it's actually done well, Monty. I'm sick of seeing so many of these films be hacky and not that great. I think the casting's great. Some of the scenes are excellent. We can get into it in the next one. I even think, by the way, the decision not to put the gods in was kind of interesting, the way they handled it all. It's, by the way, also an incredible cast. Like, just look at the fucking cast of that film, mate. It's
amazing cast, especially people who I think have risen to prominence now, like Brian Cox, obviously, with Succession. He's great in this movie. And Loki has some of my favorite action sequences anywhere, in any movie. And that was like a really big part of the advertising around this movie in the 2000s. So it is fun if you haven't seen it. Watch the director's cut. It is the longer version of the film. It is massively improved over the original, like, theatrical release version. So make sure you're renting or finding the proper episode for that, and we'll see you next week.